The animal protein markets are relatively strong at the moment, given robust consumer demand for meat, milk, and eggs, both in the domestic and the export markets. The question then becomes how long that demand might hold if inflationary pressures dampen spending at some point in the coming year, or how additional COVID related challenges, such as a surge in variant fueled infections, might throw a wrench in the system. Welcome to Feedstuffs in Focus, our podcast taking a deeper look at big issues in the livestock, poultry, grain, and feed industries. I'm your host, Andy Vance. Thanks for joining us. In this episode, we talk with Brian Earnest, a protein analyst with CoBank, the national cooperative financial institution focused on rural America and part of the farm credit system. Earnest describes the current macroeconomic situation around the globe, including offering his insights into inflation and what his level of concern is about the prospect of rising prices in the year ahead. We'll also discuss the prospects for continued consumer demand and what a resurgence of COVID might do to the U.S. meat industry. Brian, you and I have had a chance to converse at different times over the years about the protein markets, and boy, it's a pretty interesting protein market coming out of what we've all been through as a society over the past 18 months. Would I be right in saying that the protein markets are extremely strong right now?
Oh, absolutely. It seems like, all around, we've got the confluence of, all tides rising, all boats in the harbor, it seems like at this point. And beef seems to be a benefactor of that. We're seeing pretty strong demand going on right now. And, there's no shortage of challenges from a production standpoint. And it seems to continue to be fueling things as we're working our way through the summer grilling period. So
I want to start because you and I are going to kind of take a methodical look through. We'll start supply side, demand side, some of the fundamentals. But let's do a macroeconomic picture. I mean, I've been following inflation. I think we had a report out today from the Fed. We're looking at maybe 5.5% inflation over the past month. What are the macro factors as it relates specifically to the beef market that you're following most closely? Is inflation a big part of that story?
I think it will be as we get out further into the year. When we look purely speaking from a demand standpoint, consumers taking on a higher price, and they're still continuing to move product. So when we look at inflation, that has the potential to cause a disruption here. As we look out further into 2021 or into 2022. But for the most part, the industry's overcome any bit of that so far. From a producer standpoint, obviously, we've got higher grain prices. That's worked into the supply stream, and they're taking that on in the feed yards. We've got, from a macro standpoint, some drought issues that have caused a disruption for the beef side as well, on the cattle side. And, so a whole confluence of things outside of what is typical or the norm. And that adds on to the challenges that the protein industry's had in the last 3-4 years. So, certainly difficulty from a macro standpoint of overcoming some of the challenges exogenous from, what the market typically faces.
And I set that question up pretty poorly, I realize, because we talk about inflation like it's this, mysterious force that is acting on, but it's really, when we talk about inflation, we're talking about the effect. It's just price increases. Inflation isn't a thing. It's what we're seeing, these other factors that are happening. So when we think about prices going up, consumers at retail paying more for beef, they don't seem to have flinched yet. Is there a point where you think, if we see 5+% inflation for this period of time, where you as an analyst might say that's cause for concern? It doesn't seem like we're there yet, but is there a point where you think, hey, consumer appetite for beef might not overcome price consciousness?
Yeah, I think they're, you're spot on there in terms of where we're at in discovery of how much more the consumer will be willing to take. And it is a inflation, something that doesn't just all of a sudden hit the industry, or, it kind of rolls on with time. And we, monitoring the markets, it worked its way through at least the production stream, over the last 12 months. It's hit the consumer pocketbook somewhat in some areas, but the COVID, lockdowns really kind of caused a disruption over the last year in terms of which side of the factor or which side of the consumer channel, really gets more of that price hit. We've got folks that are going back to conferences again. They're doing traveling again. So this is an area of the industry that's trying to attract that consumer. Retail obviously gained the consumer in 2020, and they're trying to retain that. So a little bit of that price support, they're staving off some of the retail, prices. And beef is one of those items that consumers are attracted to. They have learned how to cook it in the pandemic. They've learned how to enjoy it, and if you don't have your fine dining establishment serving that up, you're going to learn to do it on your own. And so the consumers likely recognize prices in a little bit more different fashion over the last year than they were prior to that. Typically, you're getting a nice steak at a fine dining restaurant or something like that. If you're cooking it on your own, you're starting to be a little bit more price conscious of what you're seeing there. So,
how concerned are you about, we'll just say, the economy in general? As we've talked about, seen pretty strong jobs reports recently. It seems like consumers have money to spend despite some of the continued headwinds in terms of unemployment, reopening the economy, different sectors. I guess it depends on what sector of the economy you're in. If you're in a service, if you're working in food service, as an example, you may have a totally different feeling about this than if you work in logistics for Amazon, say, as an example. But are you seeing a strong domestic economy, and what are concerns you might have if you were a beef cattle producer about the U.S. economy in the 1, 3, 5 year range?
Yeah, it's a good question, and certainly we're continuing to look for signposts. Right, there's been a lot of those things that just pop up over the last 5 years that we have to continue to monitor the situation. In terms of the economy, it seems to be doing fairly well. Whether this inflation is a little bit too much, I think the Fed kind of seems to have that mindset that it's not necessarily something concerning at this point. The jobs report continues to be a little bit better, and the difficulty is I know we talk about this throughout the industry, labor situation, right? Not having enough people willing to work, and that's not necessarily reported in the unemployment rate, or properly represented, and so that's a concern, obviously, and it may not catch up to us for another 12 months. But something to continue to monitor. Right now, things seem to be doing very well. In terms of moving meat, you look at the cold storage inventory reports, and we've got stocks that are very low levels across the board. And that's maybe more of a concern that when we get out into the tail end of the year, we don't have enough meat, right? And there's things that are being talked about in the industry to ensure that we have a fulfilled supply source for food. There's been a couple disruptions over the last 3 years, or last year, that have certainly influenced people taking another look at making sure we have continuity in meat. That kind of gets around it, but certainly there's these sort of disruptions make you open your eyes a little bit to what does the economy look like in the next year, and keeping an eye on that.
We've been talking primarily about beef since we're at a cattle industry convention, but I know you follow the broader protein sector. Are there any differences or things that you're watching in pork or poultry that would be significantly different from what we're seeing in the beef industry earlier? And you said, the rising tide raises all boats, or is the broader animal-derived protein sector seeing more or less the same trends and issues, or would you say, hey, man, there's something really wild happening over here in broilers or pork that the cattle producer or feeder or feed company watching this might need to be aware of?
Yeah, and there's some kind of some differences a little bit. When we look at the balance sheet, the exports have been very strong for protein industry overall. Asia continues to be a growing source of disappearance for U.S. meats, and certainly we want to look at the longevity of how developed is that as a source of disappearance. And the poultry industry, they've taken an approach of doing some fantastic marketing in terms of the products. We had the chicken sandwich wars that kind of came up back out of nowhere again here this year, and that really helped to move some chicken through the system. Of course, on the pork side, exports is one that we continue to look at. I think there's some more challenges out front amongst the different proteins. Certainly, when you look at California's Prop 12 coming into play in 2022, it has the end result of disrupting the pork industry a bit in terms of supply. That'll have some impact there. The chicken industry, they were on a pretty strong expansion phase here over the last 4 years, and COVID kind of slowed that down a little bit. All of the industry continue to point to labor as an issue, and kind of keeps the competing meats from expanding. The cattle industry looks like it's on the downside of the cattle cycle, so we should probably expect that we're going to see fewer cattle out ahead of us. And I guess one of the things I'm kind of questioning is, so what steps in its place? Pork is probably not going to expand. We're probably going to see a similar situation there. So without as much red meat, does chicken step in, or potentially one of these alternative proteins to sit on the plate a little bit more? So it's going to be interesting in the next 3-4 years to monitor, what the consumer is wanting to put on their plate, and how that has some additional influence through the production streams.
One of the things I think about, since you mentioned the alternative protein sector, and I've heard this a few different times this week, is, the data, purchasing data, we could be talking about kind of qualitative consumer research type data. Consumers like eating beef. It tastes good, right? It's, something that we associate maybe with celebrations or good times or fun with friends and family and whatnot. How concerned would you be today, if you were a producer of beef, about those alternative proteins in the context that you just set up there about, okay, what is the consumer choosing to put on the plate? Is it something I need to just continue to be aware of, or is this something that should be keeping me up at night? I think our default setting is, oh God, this keeps me up at night. But my question is, should it?
Yeah, and I think, monitoring over the last 3 years, that is more of a, let's be conscious of what's going on in the space, right? And what consumers are asking for. And make sure if we can address that in a, from a competing protein standpoint, that the industry is properly doing that. So, in terms of how much space that will occupy going forward, I agree. The data is kind of mixed right now on sales of, how well, some of the, the alternative proteins have done in the pandemic, and how much more growth is potentially either at retail or food service. That's another thing. I point to the chicken sandwich war, and there was introductions of the plant-based proteins at burger outlets here over the last 3 years. Everybody was kind of monitoring that of, how successful is this going to be? I think, beef has an opportunity here probably at the QSR segment after there's some fatigue potentially in from those chicken sandwiches. I know they're still rolling out, new and exciting chicken sandwiches, but it may be time to switch back to burgers and look at that as a potential for, back to school promotion or something like that. So it's still being conscious of, where does it fall into play? We know consumer behavior changed rather significantly in 2020. Whether it reverts back to pre-COVID level or, pre-COVID behavior, it's a little bit yet to be seen, Thinking about back to school, kids are, getting ready. Moms and dads are trying to figure out what goes on the plate. And how often they're going to have to stop through the drive-through or if they're going to need frozen pizzas in the freezer. I think most people are used to having more food in the refrigerator. And that kind of led into some of the stronger demand that we saw late springtime, early summer when the dining restrictions eased. People were still putting, enough eggs in the refrigerator to last them a little bit longer in case they had to do it. And but they started going out again. They started going to dining establishments, or at least doing more takeout. So we're probably looking at another shift in consumer behavior here in the next 6 months of what happens when kids start going back to school, people start going back to work again, or back into the office. So so that's something we need to monitor as well. What are they putting in the basket, but where are they visiting to get their food too? So.
Our thanks to Brian Earnest from CoBank for joining us to offer his insights in the current outlook for animal proteins at home and abroad. I talked with Brian during the Cattle Industry Annual Convention at NCBA Trade Show in Nashville, Tennessee. Also had a very interesting conversation with Oklahoma State University professor Darrell Peel, one of the leading experts in what's happening in the live cattle markets. We talked quite a bit about drought, as well as some of the issues that I discussed with Brian Earnest. The two pieces are a really great companion set if you want to know what's happening in the protein markets and what lies ahead. If you want to watch my interview with Dr. Peel, visit us at Feedstuffs 365, which of course is part of your Feedstuffs subscription. You can access Feedstuffs 365 via feedstuffs.com. For the latest economic news facing the food animal and animal feed production industries and how those trends and issues affect your business, subscribe to the Feedstuffs Daily e-newsletter. I'm Andy Vance, and you've been listening to Feedstuffs in Focus. Thanks for joining us today. If you want to hear more conversations about some of the big issues affecting the livestock, poultry, grain, and feed industries, subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platforms, including Apple and Google Podcasts. Or visit our website, feedstuffs.com, for future episodes and to check out Feedstuffs 365. Until next time, have a great day, and thanks for listening.